Once upon a time, the story begins, and you know right away it's a fairy tale. You also know that it's all about magic, or elves, or gnomes, and that it happened way back in the past in some strange country. There's something about witches and wicked stepmothers and seven-league boots that holds everybody's interest, from tiny tots to old people. Walt Disney found that out when the movie Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs drew record crowds all over the United States and Europe. His latest fairy tale movie, Cinderella, did just as well. Did you ever stop to wonder where these strange tales of long ago came from? The more you learn about fairy tales, the more surprising they become. Everybody knows Grimm's fairy tales and the wonder stories written by Hans Christian Andersen. But very few people realize that these men just wrote down stories they had heard or found in ancient manuscripts. How long ago fairy stories began, no one knows. All we do know is that similar stories were told thousands of years ago in ancient Egypt, and India records of other similar stories are found in prehistoric Australia, New Zealand, and in the Indian lore of America. Nevertheless, three men are responsible for putting these stories into interesting form and giving them to the modern world. And just knowing who these men are and how they did it gives you a subject that will interest other people when you talk about it. Jacob Grimm was born in the year 1785 at Hanau in Hesse-Kassel, Germany. Hesse-Kassel was part of the province of Hesse, which sent Hessian soldiers to America to help the English in the Revolutionary War. But that happened before Jacob and his younger brother Wilhelm had arrived in this world. They attended public school, then went to Marburg together to study law. In the course of their studies, they attended lectures on ancient Roman law, and Jacob became interested in studying historical manuscripts. Wilhelm also became interested, and the two brothers worked together investigating every scrap of evidence they could find on ancient people and stories. The brothers both became librarians so they could continue their studies of history. By the year 1808, Jacob had been appointed superintendent of the private library of Jerome Bonaparte, who was king of Westphalia. Wilhelm became his assistant, and the brothers continued to work together. Among other things, they were charmed by stories of the Middle Ages which told about mythical beasts, monsters, and dragons. Both kept notes of whatever they found and later arranged them in such a way that soon a whole book of stories began to take form. These were strange tales out of the past, but they held a fascination that made the brothers grow more and more excited as they went along. Finally, they started writing the results of years of work, and their first book was published. It was called Children and House Legends. In no time at all, the Grimm brothers were famous. The book became popular all over Europe, and in its English translation, it became a household word in far-off America. But it did more than make them famous. It founded the science of modern folklore, the recording of legends everywhere. Fairy stories are simply stories in which fairies play a part, or which contain strange or magical happenings. For instance, in Puss in Boots, the seven-league boots have wonderful powers. Therefore, it is a fairy story. The same is true of Beauty and the Beast, Sleeping Beauty, and all the others. Hans Christian Andersen was born a few years after the Grimm brothers, but he grew up without ever hearing of them. He was born in the year 1805 at Odense on the island of Funen off the Danish mainland. He always said the island was 100 years behind the times. There was little to do except dream. Remember, that was before the days of steamboats and trains. There were no airplanes, no automobiles, no telephones or radio. The only way people heard news of the world was when ships came in, and the sailors told what they had seen and heard in various ports. But in the evening before the open fireplace and along the lanes on sunny afternoons, old women told Hans-old stories about elves and fairies. Hans watched the cattle in the fields and pictured the great beasts the stories told about. But that, too, was natural, because the stories he heard were nature myths that had been repeated from generation to generation through the centuries.
And nature myths are stories that try to explain mysteries in nature, like lightning and thunder, earthquakes, landslides, and the changing seasons.
They came from the days far in the distant past of history, when people believed that every object, tree, plant, house, or stone had personal life. That's why a tree can suddenly start to talk in a fairy story. It may tell the person it speaks to that a witch put a curse on it. Perhaps it may be freed from the curse and become a prince before the story is finished. That is what makes these old stories hold their interest. The question always sticks in the reader's mind.
Is it possible that fairies did exist in olden times?
Is it possible that there was a race of midgets that lived in tiny dugouts and underground rooms,
Keeping out of sight of grown-ups, but sometimes playing with children?
Hans Christian Andersen told the stories just as he heard them, as though they were true, and he believed in them. And when his book of wonder stories appeared, his name joined the name of Grimm as a household word all over the world. Sleeping Beauty came to life, and Hopper My Thumb was a real person. Prince Charming roamed the face of the earth, and the little tailor, who killed 7 flies with 1 stroke, became a hero. Many of the fairy tales have to do with travel. Sometimes it is only from one imaginary kingdom to another, but other times they show scenes in real cities and countries. Andersen longed to travel and see the world. Whenever he had the chance, he told about these places in his stories. So the reader of fairy stories gains an education in travel if he pays attention to the people and their dress and customs. Many of the castles described in fairy stories actually existed in Denmark and Germany 100 years ago. Some of them still stand unchanged, and the towers where witches stirred their evil brew look just as threatening as ever. The castle kitchen, where her wicked stepmother made Cinderella a slave, probably still exists, with the stone-tiled floor a little more worn and uneven from the tread of human feet. Witches usually lived in huts deep in the shadows of the forest, because shadows were evil, like the night. The sunshine was good because it was light. Like the day it ruled, witches were always more powerful at night because they worked with the devil. But morning always came, and good always conquered evil. Every country in the world has its own fairy tale too. In Ireland, the fairies and leprechauns have certain rights which must not be forgotten. One side of the house belongs to them, and dirty water must never be thrown out on that side for fear it might hit one of them. They would be bound to take their revenge. No buildings can be built on that side of the house, and no additions put on it, because it might interfere with the fairies. In England, it is the brownies who steal from people's gardens and play tricks if things aren't to their liking. In America, we accept all the stories as though they belong to us, but the only real leftover in which we play a part is Halloween Eve, when the witches ride and play tricks. Only sometimes people suspect the tricks aren't really played by witches and hobgoblins, but fairy stories will always live, because people like to dream about strange countries. Strange kingdoms are like castles in the clouds. We can make them fit our own ideas of what they should be. And the Grimm and Andersen fairy tales laid the foundation for this whole imaginary world. The end.